Hello and welcome to another post-processing tutorial. As promised in the last video, today we're gonna look at some advanced cloning techniques using this image here from the ArcGIS, where I have quite a few footprints which I want to remove, and as a bonus I'll also show you some advanced image transformations. As I said in the last video, for such desert photos I want them to look pristine and I don't want to have so many footprints, and here you obviously see those footprints here. They need to go, those footprints, we have some stuff lying around here in the background and also here in the foreground. So what I typically do is first I create a new layer, an empty layer, and then I take this healing brush tool, which does a quite good job of removing such footprints. So typically what I do, I just sample an area, then I go over and I draw upwards. And for such areas here, which you have in the shade, where there's not too much structure, this is a very easy way to remove any footprints. It's very simple. And yeah, just go over it a few times, usually drawing in a direction, sampling, and there's not too much to it. But now let's look here at this bottom, where we now have some structure. Again, the healing brush tool does a very good job if I line it up a bit. So here you should look at the preview and try to at least roughly line up the structures you sample with the area where you're painting. So I just do this, and I do it for the other footprints also. And now what happens often when I do this, you see here you get a few spots. So the structure is fine, but in terms of color and brightness you have some blotches, so it's not that even as in this area. So let me quickly finish this up, then you see the final result, what I mean. Let's just also paint down here, so really remove all the footprints. And here you see it especially, that's because of the healing brush tool. It tries to also take in some of the surroundings and tries to match not only the structures but also the color and brightness, and this sometimes doesn't work so well. But on the other hand, if I would use just the clone stamp tool, I usually don't get that good results with the transitions, especially when I have such structures in the frame. So I like to use the healing brush, and we're gonna deal with those blotches and those uneven transitions in the next step. So let me first finish this up. Also here, this one, just draw a few times. This one, really getting all those little footprints and distracting elements out of the frame. Down here we have something more. This one, it's also good to sample from some different areas just to make sure that you don't have obvious repetitions. And now let's zoom out, and while the footprints are gone, you see this doesn't look too well now. And just continuing to use the healing brush, also the clone stamp tool, might solve it at some point, but it's a lot of work, and there's actually a much easier way. So first of all, it's important that I now have all the structures in place. So I did a good cloning in terms of just the high frequencies in the image. But the job wasn't done so well for the lower frequencies. And I think you know what I'm getting at. What we can now use here is frequency separation, which I showed you for other use cases already, where I use it, for example, to remove chromatic aberrations. I use it to remove lens flares from the image, and I leave links to those videos below. Today we're gonna use it to clean up this uneven color here. So let's first flatten down this layer, Ctrl+Shift+Alt+E, so create a new one. And I also have to duplicate this one once more. This one, this lower one, I call low for low frequency. And if you watched my other videos, you already know what's coming, how this works, but I go through the steps very quickly anyway. So the low frequency layer is the one which I want to use later to remove all those uneven areas. So what I do, I will now blur it using a Gaussian blur, and I will blur it just as much that the high frequency, the fine structures which I just cloned, are no longer visible, but I still want to see all those blotches. And now you see it very well when I go with like 8 pixels. You see this little unevenness here in the sand, which you don't have up here, but down here this is not very nice, also this blotch. So I blur it by 8 pixels. Now I select the high layer and I go to image, apply image, and here I have to set this to add. This one here has to be invert. The layer I use will be the low layer, so that's important. You select the layer which you just blurred, you leave it at RGB, you activate this invert box. The blending mode is set to add, opacity to 100 and scale to 2. Those are the settings you need when you're working on a 16-bit image. If you have an 8-bit image, you need other settings and you can look them up, there are other tutorials. But you should always work, in my opinion, with 16 bits because this gives you much more freedom to work on contrasts and colors without getting any banding. I apply it and now I have to set the blend mode here to linear light, and voila, when I now zoom in, you see before and after looks exactly the same, but I now have this low layer, and here what I can now do, I can do some cloning, and for this I can just use the clone stamp tool and I can tell it just to sample the current and the one beneath, so the low layer. I go with like 20% and then I just sample and draw a bit. This way I can even out the area. And you see how this works before and after. But there's a simpler way. What I can also do, let's flatten it again. I can just blur this layer. And I go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And here I just blur it as much as I need to remove those blotches. And I blur it by those 60 pixels. Also down here you still have this one, so I'm just gonna clone it. So trying to just remove it. And now what I just gonna do is put a black mask on it and I just reveal it down here in this area where I did the cloning, where the cloning didn't work so nice. Down here, so really getting it clean. Also this area, so you can really make a very smooth transition down here. The magic happens when I activate the high layer now, and now you see how beautiful and clean the cloning is. So let's see where we started. We started here with a background. Then we did some first cloning, which was okay, but as you see, here's a lot of those blotches, doesn't look even. Now let's bring in the frequency separation and suddenly it looks very smooth, very clean. And yeah, this is how I do cloning for images with sand, also with snow and other fine structures. I usually do a combination where I first do some cloning, focusing on the details, and then I use frequency separation to further smooth out the result. Now I won't bother with the rest here. For the sake of this demonstration, what I now do, I hinted at this in the beginning. I want to show you some advanced image transformations here. So let's flatten this down again. So you see up here we have a lot of sky, which I don't necessarily want. So what I would typically do, I want to go for a 2x1 panel here. So let's do this first to give us roughly the outline of what we want to work with or what we want to achieve. But still, even with a panel, I still have the sky up here, and this is taking the viewer out of the picture. So what I want to do now is first I'll select just the upper part here of the image, just above the camels or the dromedaries. I press Ctrl T and I stretch it a bit, so making those dunes quite a bit higher, which I think for such abstract shapes as dunes is quite okay. So I wouldn't do it for mountains because then, yeah, you really change the landscape and some landmarks. But those dunes, abstract shapes, I think it's fine. So let's pull this up until we lose the bright spot up here in this edge and press enter. So now what we're left with is this bright area and this bright area. So how are we gonna deal with it? First, what I don't like so much in this image is that he's just walking here on a horizontal. I want to have this image a bit more dynamic. So what I'm gonna do now, I press Ctrl T and I do some perspective corrections. So holding down Control, I can drag up this handle here, so making it a little more dynamic, and I'll drag down this handle. And I can't go too much, but still I can do quite a perspective here, making it look like he's more moving upwards and away from me. So let's do this even a bit more, but I have to be careful so the camels are not stretched too much, and I might even compensate it by dragging in this direction just a bit. So now we have a slight diagonal going on, and this looks much more interesting in my opinion. So let's apply this and see the before and the after. And now zoom in, that it still looks good, and he's even looking at me, so that's quite nice. So before and after. So the camels are now perspectively stretched a bit, but not too much. So if you look at before and after, if you wouldn't see this comparison, you wouldn't know. So I think that's okay. And also what we did now, we lost all the bright sky up here. And now we have a very captivating image where I could now further reduce or remove footprints. I would apply my typical post-processing to arrive at the final result. And yeah, hope you liked this, gave you some new ideas about processing. And yeah, let me know in the comments what are some techniques you use for cloning. There's certainly more techniques you can use. And yeah, see you hopefully in the next video. Bye.